So one way that I have attempted to learn about children's capacities for education is to look at hunter-gatherer bands. So now we're on B on this handout. During most of human existence, we were all hunter-gatherers. Agriculture was first developed about 10 or 11,000 years ago, which in terms of biological evolutionary time is essentially nothing. We evolved our instincts. These instincts that I'm talking about would have evolved in the context of a hunter-gatherer way of life. And that's why it was interesting to me to try to learn something about how hunter-gatherer children become educated. So a number of years ago, I started by reading everything I could that had been written by anthropologists who had studied or lived in hunter-gatherer cultures in various remote parts of the world where they were, at least at the time that they were studied, they had been relatively unaffected by Western culture and were still presumably living in the kinds of ways that they would have lived before the development of agriculture. Since there wasn't a whole lot written about children, I supplemented that by identifying 10 anthropologists, relatively well-known anthropologists, who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures and studied 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures on 3 different continents. So choosing people who had looked at hunter-gatherers in a variety of different places. These hunter-gatherers, by the way, are all in the category that would be called band hunter-gatherers. Presumably, most anthropologists think this is the way people would have lived, primarily the way they would have lived prior to agricultural times. And what I learned in looking at these, at what had been written and what I learned from the anthropologists is that there are certain similarities among all of these cultures. They live in small bands, which is why I qualify them, calling them band hunter-gatherers. They live in small bands which move regularly from place to place. They're nomadic, they oftentimes have a sort of circuit of movement within a fairly somewhat defined, somewhat undefined territory. They do not condone violence. That doesn't mean violence doesn't occur. They're human beings. Anger occurs. Sometimes there's violence that occurs, but they don't, unlike many of the agricultural societies that follow them, they don't condone it. They try to stop it. They don't think that it's a good thing, for example, to try to avenge some offense the way many other cultures do. They are non-violent in terms of their beliefs, and they're pretty good at preventing violence within the culture. They are extraordinarily and egalitarian. In fact, they are by far the most egalitarian cultures that anthropologists have ever found. And for that reason, they are also called, another term that anthropologists use to label such cultures is egalitarian cultures. These are cultures that do not have leaders. They don't have chiefs. They don't have big men. They don't have a hierarchical structure of society. They make all their decisions within the band by consensus. So they'll talk it out until they come to an agreement of what they're going to do. So in my survey of anthropologists, I was interested in the relationships between adults and children in the culture that they studied and in the activities of children. And that led to 3 conclusions, which I've listed here on your hand. The first conclusion is that adults do not direct children's activities. It's part of hunter-gatherers' egalitarianism, part of their belief in, part of their egalitarianism is they think that nobody has the right to tell somebody else what to do. And they carry that to what in our culture seems like an extreme. It really seems like an extreme. They really don't tell somebody else what to do. If somebody asks you for advice, they're very happy to give advice. But you wouldn't just step in. If I saw you doing something and I thought you weren't really doing it right, it would be offensive for me to step in and tell you the right way to do it, because that would make it seem like I'm a big shot and you're kind of a subordinate. Now, what's really remarkable is they apply this to children as well as to adults. They don't tell children what to do. That's hard to believe. But the first time I heard it from an anthropologist, I thought, wow, that's this person's view of it. I can't really believe that. But after I heard this from anthropologist after anthropologist and read it in their writings, I had to begin to believe it. Let me just read 3 quotations that give you an idea of what the anthropologists, the observers of these cultures themselves have said. So here's one from anthropologist Yumi Goso, who's studied the South American group called the Paracana. Hunter-gatherer, but here she's talking about hunter-gatherers in general, based on her review of hunter-gatherer relationship to children. Hunter-gatherers do not give orders to children. For example, no adult announces bedtime. At night, children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them, physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. They just assume that the kids are going to develop okay. Here's another quote. This is from Jean Leidloff that some of you may have heard of. She wrote a book that's become something of a Bible of natural parenting people called The Continuum. She got the idea for this book from her observations when she was a young woman of a hunter-gatherer group. Also, this happened to be in the Amazon. She wrote, "The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the quantum vocabulary behaviors. There is great interest in what everyone does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce anyone. The child's will is his motive force." That's essentially what I heard over and over again. And now here's one more quote. This one from somebody who was studying a group of Inuit in the Hudson Bay area. "Infants and young children are allowed to explore the environments to the limits of their physical capacities and with minimal interference from adults. Thus, if a child picks up a hazardous object, parents generally leave it to explore the dangers on its own. The child is presumed to know what it is doing." One of my colleagues at Boston College, Gilda Morelli, lived with a hunter-gatherer group and studied a hunter-gatherer group called the FA for many, many months in the late 1980s. And she showed me slides of little toddlers, like 1.5 to 2-year-olds, playing with fire, playing with machetes, playing with bows and arrows, adults sitting back, not paying any attention to this. And this apparently characterizes hunter-gatherers in general. And I asked her, do the children, don't they burn themselves? Don't they sometimes cut themselves? She said, yeah, they do sometimes. When most people have some kind of scars, but they don't wound themselves in serious manner in this way. And in those cultures that have tools that truly could kill them, like poison darts, those are kept way up high in a tree where little children could never get to them. These are not negligent parents. These are parents who have a different conception of what is risk and what is not risk. It's okay for children to hurt themselves. That it's better to let children have that freedom and not deprive them of the opportunity to explore. It's better to let them begin using and practicing with these tools, which are so important to be able to know how to use to be successful in the culture. In some sense, probably, the earlier you begin to use them, the better you will be at them. So they trust children, and apparently this has been going on for who knows how many hundreds of thousands of years, and here we are. They've survived as beings. Children haven't killed themselves off by virtue of the fact that their parents allow them to play with these dangerous things. So that's the second conclusion from my looking into hunter-gatherer cultures is that children, including teenagers, have essentially unlimited time to play and explore. Basically, when I talk about childhood with hunter-gatherers, I'm talking about from age 4 on through kind of mid to late teenage years. These are the years in which children are spending most of their time with other children, away from adults, where very little, if any, work is expected of them, where the hunter-gatherer adults believe that it's quite right and proper that they're off playing and exploring with other kids because this is how they learn what they need to know to be successful in the culture. So just a couple of quotes that really typify what all of the anthropologists said to me. One researcher said both girls and boys had almost all day, every day, free to play. And another said children were free to play nearly all the time. No one expected children to do serious work until they were in their late teens. It turns out that one thing I learned in this survey was that generally speaking, hunter-gatherer adults regard children as having reached the age of common sense when they're about 4 years old. That's the age at which they no longer have to be in the presence of an adult because they can be trusted to more pretty much take care of themselves. They're not going to go running off alone into the jungle and get eaten by a tiger. They're not going to play with a poisonous snake. They're not going to do things, whereas a 3-year-old you can't be so sure. So that around 4, they consider that to be the age of common sense. So interesting to compare that to us. I would say that in the 1950s, that was kind of true, even in U.S. culture. By the time I was 5, I was trusted to go anywhere in town. And most 5-year-olds, I don't know most, but certainly many 5, it wasn't just my parents, many 5-year-olds. We've changed, throughout, I would say throughout most of human history, we felt that around 4 or 5 kids are grown up enough that we don't have to monitor them all the time. We can trust them. We can let them just go out and play with other kids. And that certainly was true of hunter-gatherer children. And I'm arguing that it was pretty much true of cultures everywhere, including our North American Western culture until relatively recent, until the last few decades. Third conclusion that I came to from this study is that in their exploration and play, children acquire the knowledge and practice the skills that are essential for success in their culture. So one of the questions I asked was, what did the children play at in the culture that you observed? And people listed things, and I went through the list, and of course they varied somewhat from culture to culture, partly I'm sure based on what the anthropologists happened to notice or think what was important. But to some degree, at least, you could predict what they would play at by knowing what are the skills they had to develop in that culture. So here are just some of the things that were listed that children were playing at. Digging up tubers, fishing, smoking porcupines out of holes. This sounds like work, but this is all in the spirit of play. This is the kids, nobody's expecting them to actually bring home food, although once in a while they might, just because they enjoy doing that too. Cooking, caring for infants, climbing trees, building vine ladders, building huts, using knives and other tools, making tools, carrying heavy loads, building rafts, making fires, defending against attacks from pretend predators, imitating animals, which would be a means of practicing identifying animals, making music, dancing, storytelling, and arguing were all mentioned. Remember, this is a culture that makes decisions by consensus, so you better be pretty good if you're going to have influence at that culture by the time you're an adult, to be good at getting your ideas across and convincing people. And it's interesting that a number of the anthropologists talked about how children would practice that a great deal in their skills, and sometimes they would mimic and even mock the arguments, the bad arguments that they heard among adults at the campfire the previous day. So they're kind of rehashing, they're paying attention to what how the adults are arguing, and they are learning both from the good and the bad of what they hear. So all of the respondents said that the boys in the culture that they observed played endlessly at tracking and at hunting. If it's a culture that used bows and arrows, that shooting bows and arrows. If it's a culture that used darts and blowpipes and darts, they practiced at that. tracking and hunting require enormous skill. And not surprisingly, the boys see this as a valuable thing to learn, and they're practicing it all the time. All of this never because an adult is telling them to do it, or even encouraging them to do it, but just because this is what they want to do. They see that these are things that are important in my culture. Interesting to note that one of the cultures that was included in my study was a culture in the Philippines called the Otto, where women as well as men hunt. And not surprisingly, in that culture, the girls as well as the boys practice tracking and hunting. So what's happening is children are looking out, they're observing what people, especially people of their own gender, do, and they are incorporating that into their play and becoming good at it in that way. So in sum, hunter-gatherer adults do not deliberately educate children. Instead, they give children lots of free time to play and explore, and thereby allow children to educate themselves. Now, I want to just say a few words. What happened after hunter-gatherer period? Why don't we still have that? What happened to society? Well, what happened to society was agriculture. Agriculture changed people's way of living in a very fundamental way. Hunter-gatherers didn't own land. In fact, they didn't own much of anything because there's no point in owning more than you can carry with you. And so if you don't have landowners and you don't have ways of stockpiling riches, you don't have a hierarchy in society. Everybody's kind of equal. And their whole mode of existence depended upon sharing. You had to share everything. Otherwise, you couldn't really survive as a hunter-gatherer if you weren't in a group that shared with other people. Well, agriculture changed things. Obviously, if you're going to farm, you've got to own the land that you farm. You can't go to all the work of planting and cultivating and then just let somebody else walk in and take it away from you. So you've got to stake that land out and own it. Now we have ultimately from this a situation where some people own land and some people don't own land. And the people who don't own land are dependent on the ones who do. So now we have hierarchy in society. And ultimately, this hierarchy grew over time and time. It really reached an apex in feudalism, where just a few lords owned all the land. And basically, everybody else was a servant of one sort or another to the lords who owned all the land. And it's interesting that that's the world out of which much of our understanding of children and child raising arose. The whole goal of child raising for hunter-gatherers was to foster the child's free will. The whole goal of parenting, of child raising after hunter-gatherer period, unless you were a lord, was to suppress free will. And for good reason, because if you are destined to be a servant, a slave, a serf, dependent upon a lord and master who at any point could kill you, or at minimum stop supporting you, you better unquestioningly obey. You better not be too much of a critical thinker. You better not be too creative. You better be the kind of person who's a good servant doing what you are told to do no matter how boring it is. And now we also have a world, whereas hunter-gatherer world, most of the so-called work was pretty exciting. Hunting and gathering, these are kind of exciting. It's always different, it takes skill and so on. Now we're entering a world where there's a certain amount of work that's drudgery. You know, farming, I don't want to put down farming. There's certainly a lot of skill involved, but there's also a lot of unskilled labor involved with farming. Just plain weeding and cultivating and so on and so forth. And even children can do that. So you can get, now children have to work. Families get larger, children have to work to help support their younger siblings. We enter into the world where children are now, unlike all of human history before that, where children are now working and where children are being raised to follow orders and do what they're told to do rather than free will. what is still the underlying theories about child development that we still haven't grown out of them, came out of that period of history. And I don't know if you've ever tried to look at the Bible. I don't want to offend people about religion, but if you've ever tried to look at the Bible to get ideas about child raising, what does the Bible have to say about child raising? Here's what you find. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. That's Proverbs 22:15. Deuteronomy 21:18-21. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, he will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gate of the town. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. You know, this is pretty severe. But this is basically what the Bible has to tell us. I mean, it's not a good, I would not recommend the Bible as a source of parenting. And it's not just the Old Testament. Here is Matthew 15:4. For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father and mother shall be put to death. The reason for all of this, at that time in history, there was good reason for it. You wanted to train children to fear those people who had authority over them. And the first person to fear then is your own father, who could kill you or have you killed, right? Because that is the training to be sure that you fear the Lord of the manor, or that you fear whoever is your master. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is because, and also with the rise of industry, that didn't really improve things. We all know what happened with the Industrial Revolution. Now you still have hierarchy. You have those who own businesses and those who are dependent on those who own businesses. And we had child labor, enormous amounts of child labor. So this whole idea of children's free will went out the window. Now free will and play, all became sinfulness. Now, the point I'm trying to get at is out of this came schools as we know them today. If there is a father of our modern-day schooling system, it is August Hermann Francke, who was a pietist priest, a Protestant pietist priest in Prussia in the late 17th century. And he started in Prussia the first widespread system of compulsory education. And these schools were Protestant run, and he was very explicit in his instructions to schoolmasters about the purpose of the schools. So let me just read a couple of quotations from him. Above all, it is necessary to break the natural willfulness of the child. While the schoolmaster who seeks to make the child more learned is to be commended, he has not done enough. He has forgotten his most important task, namely that of making the will obedient. And another place he wrote, youth do not know how to regulate their lives and are naturally inclined toward idle and sinful behavior when left to their own devices. For this reason, it is a rule in this institution that a pupil never be allowed out of the presence of a supervisor. The supervisor's presence will stifle the pupil's inclination to sinful behavior and slowly weaken his willfulness. The schools that Francke started in Prussia were modeled all over Europe and in the colonies in America. And eventually, as the power of religion waned and the power of states increased, they were taken over by the states. But still in the same model. If you were to walk into one of Francke's schools, you would clearly recognize it as a school. The children are in rows, the master is giving them lessons, reward and punishment is the motive, is the manner of teaching, curiosity has nothing to do with it. And what is being taught as dogma. Initially, of course, it was biblical dogma, and the children couldn't. Far from critical thinking, you would be in trouble if you questioned any of it. You're learning, the whole purpose of schooling was indoctrination and obedience training. Related to that was reading, because the Protestants, unlike the Catholics before them, believed that it was important for every person to read the Bible themselves. So reading was being taught primarily so that people would read the Bible initially. So when school was passed on, it became the state running schools. The state leaders, everybody admired these Prussian schools. This is the way to get a subordinate population. This is mind control. They were almost very explicit about that. This is how we get people. So now the dogma became how wonderful the state is and how terrible the enemies to the state are and so on. And it became ways of training little soldiers. Napoleon loved the idea of schooling, and so on. So this, and even in the United States, Horace Mann was who started the first state-controlled compulsory school system in Massachusetts, was very clear that this came out of the distrust of people. That we have to shape people to think the right thoughts, think in the right ways. There have always been people who don't really trust democracy. And schooling was sort of the way of dealing with that problem in their mind. So our schools are still in this mode. Most people who are teachers, most people who call themselves educators, don't think that their job today is indoctrination and obedience training. They might say, what I really want to do is foster creativity. What I really want to do is foster creative thinking, curiosity. But no matter what the goal is, you are stuck with school, with Frankie's model of a school. If you were to design a school to foster creativity, to foster critical thinking, to foster to foster curiosity, would look nothing like Frankie's school. You can't do that if you want everybody to do the same things at the same time in step like. You can't do that if you're going to test them, because if people are going to be curious, they're going to follow different things. And you'd have to create a different test for everybody, and how would you even do that? If you want people to think critically, they're going to question what you think is the lesson rather than feed it back to you. You know, you can't, we have a school system that was very well designed for the purpose that Frankie designed it for, and it is incompatible with the goals of helping children develop their creativity and their critical thinking and those kinds of, and pursuing their and curiosity that we want. Now, I recognize that throughout the history, at least the modern history of schooling, there have always been reformers who have attempted to bring progressive changes. But all of these changes have just been tinkering with the system. Nobody has said, oh, we just got to throw it out and start all over again, because tinkering isn't going to solve the problem. Tinkering isn't going to solve, as long as we have a system where teachers are responsible for children's learning, and teachers' job is to make sure that children learn certain things, then we have a system in which it is not curiosity that motivates the child, but rather it is the system, some kind of a system, hidden or overt, of reward and punishment and direction to get the child to do it. And in every school, the primary thing that every child has to do in order to pass is to obey. If you don't obey in school, you will fail. If you obey, there's almost no way to fail, because the lessons are actually trivially easy. Anybody can do them. It's just a matter of being willing to do it. So still today, the primary lesson of schooling, as we know it, is obedience. To do what the teacher tells you to do, without questioning. Now, some people today will argue, and they might present a good argument, that is an important lesson. Maybe that is an important lesson. I think if it's important at all, it is way, way less important than it used to be. And we all know the dangers of unquestioning obedience. We certainly saw that in Hitler's Germany. So we know the dangers, and if we want people to be critical thinking and questioning, they're not going to learn that in the schools that we have.